Life has a way of planting the seeds of destiny in the most unexpected places. On a struggling farm in coastal Maine, where the ocean breeze carries whispers of dreams long forgotten, James Miller's calloused hands tell a story of 30 years of relentless toil and fading hope. His world is confined to the boundaries of his failing crops and mounting debts, until the day a sophisticated stranger's broken bicycle leads her to his doorstep. What begins as a simple repair becomes the catalyst for an extraordinary transformation that neither of them could have imagined. But when she returns in a gleaming yacht instead of her repaired bicycle, James must confront a question that will challenge everything he believes about fate and second chances. Could one act of kindness really be enough to rewrite the story of your life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The morning fog rolled in from the Atlantic, wrapping Miller's farm in a familiar grey embrace. James Miller stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug warming his weathered hands, watching the sun struggle to pierce the dense Maine mist. The foreclosure notice lay on his ancient oak table, its crisp white paper a stark contrast to the worn wood, a table that had belonged to his father and his father before him. He took a long sip of coffee, black and bitter like the thoughts that had kept him awake most of the night. The bank had given him 30 days. 30 days to somehow manifest a miracle that 3 decades of honest work hadn't managed to produce. Outside, the early autumn wind rustled through rows of struggling corn, their stalks too thin, too yellow. This season's drought had been particularly cruel, turning what should have been his saving grace into another disappointment. The irrigation system, ancient pipes his father had installed in the 70s, had finally given up the ghost in mid-July, leaving him to watch helplessly as his crops withered under the unrelenting sun. James pulled on his work boots, their leather, cracked but still sturdy, just like everything else on this farm, holding on by sheer stubbornness. As he stepped onto his porch, the wood creaking beneath his feet, his eyes traced the familiar landscape. 5 generations of Millers had worked this land, had weathered storms both literal and figurative, had passed down stories of perseverance along with calloused hands and an unwavering work ethic. The morning chores waited for no man, regardless of how many sleepless nights he'd endured. The chickens needed feeding, the ancient tractor required its daily coaxing to life, and somewhere in the Northfield, a section of fence needed mending. Again, his days had become an endless cycle of repairs, fixing what was broken, patching what was torn, and hoping it all held together for just one more season. Sarah would have known what to do. His late wife had always been the optimist between them, seeing opportunity where he saw obstacles. Even during her final days 5 years ago, she'd maintained that unwavering faith in the farm's potential. "This land has magic in it, James," she'd say, her voice weak but her eyes bright. "It just needs someone who can see it." The memory of her voice still had the power to stop him in his tracks. He paused by the barn door, running his hand along the sun-bleached wood where Sarah had once insisted on painting their names, back when they were newlyweds full of dreams and plans. The paint had long since faded, but if you knew where to look, you could still make out the heart she'd drawn around their initials. Inside the barn, James found temporary solace in the familiar routine. The chickens clucked expectantly at his approach, and old Bessie, their last dairy cow, mooed a morning greeting. The animal's gentle eyes watched him as he worked, seemingly understanding the weight he carried. They were down to just her now, having sold off most of the herd 2 years ago when the milk prices had plummeted. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention. Through the barn's dusty window, he spotted Ted Harrison's pickup truck making its way up the drive. Ted, the local feed store owner, had been more than just a supplier over the years. He'd become something of a friend, though lately their interactions had grown strained under the weight of James's mounting tab. "Morning, Jim," Ted called out, climbing down from his truck. His expression carried that careful neutrality James had become all too familiar with. Lately, the look of someone trying to balance friendship with business necessity. "Thought I'd swing by, see how you're holding up." James nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Still standing, Ted. That's something, I suppose." Ted's eyes scanned the property, taking in the signs of decline that James knew were impossible to miss. The peeling paint on the farmhouse, the rusting equipment in the yard, the fields that should have been ready for harvest, but instead stood, sparse and sickly. "Listen, Jim," Ted began, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "About your account." "I know, Ted, I haven't forgotten." James felt the weight of the foreclosure notice, like a physical presence in his pocket. "I've got some things in motion, just need a little more time." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There were no things in motion, no plans beyond getting through each day, hoping for a miracle while watching his family's legacy slip through his fingers like the dry, dusty soil of his fields. Ted sighed, his face softening. "The thing is, Jim, Sullivan's development has been sniffing around again. They're buying up every struggling farm in the county, turning good land into those fancy vacation homes for folks from Boston." The mention of Sullivan's development sent a familiar surge of anger through James's chest. They'd been circling his property like vultures for the past 2 years, making offers that felt more like threats, painting pictures of golf courses where his corn should be growing. "This land's not for sale, Ted. Not to Sullivan's, not to anyone." The words came out sharper than he'd intended, carrying the edge of desperation he'd been trying so hard to hide. Ted held up his hands in surrender. "Just thought you should know. They're offering good money, Jim. Better than good. And sometimes," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes knowing when to let go is just as important as knowing how to hold on." James turned away, focusing on Bessie as she munched contentedly on her hay, blissfully unaware of the human dramas unfolding around her. The morning sun had finally broken through the fog, casting long shadows across the barn floor. Another day was beginning, bringing with it the same challenges, the same impossible choices. "I'll figure something out," James said finally, more to himself than to Ted. "I have to." As Ted's truck disappeared down the driveway, James stood in the barn doorway, letting the morning sun warm his face. The farm stretched out before him, every acre holding memories, every building telling stories. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "Land's the only thing they ain't making more of, son. You hold on to it no matter what." But holding on was getting harder every day. And James was starting to wonder if maybe Ted was right. Maybe there was wisdom in knowing when to let go. The thought felt like betrayal, and he pushed it away, focusing instead on the day's tasks ahead. There was work to be done, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. He couldn't have known then that tomorrow would bring something entirely unexpected, a chance encounter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate, fortune, and the true value of holding on to what matters most. The sun had climbed high in the sky when James heard it, a strange mixture of muttered curses and the distinctive sound of bicycle wheels struggling against his gravel driveway. He stepped out from behind the tractor he'd been wrestling with all morning, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag that had long since lost its original color. A woman stood at the edge of his property, one hand on her hip, the other holding up a sleek racing bicycle that had clearly seen better days. Even from this distance, James could tell she wasn't from around here. Everything about her, from her high-end cycling gear to her confident posture, spoke of city sophistication. "Hello?" she called out, shielding her eyes against the late morning sun. "I don't suppose you know anything about bikes?" James approached slowly, taking in the scene. The bicycle was a thing of beauty, or would have been if not for the mangled chain and bent derailleur. His father's old toolbox, a heavy metal testament to generations of fixing things, sat waiting in the barn where he'd left it after morning repairs. "Might be able to help," he offered, reaching for the bike. "Mind if I take a look?" The woman, tall, athletic, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, handed over the bicycle with a grace that suggested she was used to people solving her problems. "I was making great time until about half a mile back. Then everything just," she gestured expressively, "went sideways." "These things happen," James said, already examining the damage. The chain had not only slipped but had somehow managed to wrap itself around the frame in a way that suggested either spectacular bad luck or a remarkable talent for mechanical mayhem. "I'm James Miller." "Alexandra Burke," she replied, extending a hand that was surprisingly calloused for someone who looked like she'd stepped out of a high-end sporting goods catalogue. "Though most people call me Alex, I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to find help out here. The last house I passed was miles back." James wheeled the bike toward the barn, Alexandra falling into step beside him. "Miller's farm," he said by way of explanation. "Been here since before they put in the coastal road." He pushed open the barn door, the familiar smell of hay and old wood enveloping them. Alexandra's eyes widened as she took in the interior, not with the usual pity he'd grown accustomed to seeing from visitors, but with what appeared to be genuine interest. "This is incredible," she said, running her hand along a weathered support beam. "How old is this structure?" "My great-grandfather built it in 1902, James replied, surprised by her interest. He pulled his father's toolbox from its shelf, the weight of it comfortable and familiar in his hands. The red metal was scratched and dented, each mark telling its own story of repairs made and problems solved. "You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore," Alexandra remarked, studying the barn's joinery with an expert's eye. "These mortise and tenon joints, they're perfect. No nails, just pure engineering." James paused in his examination of her bike, startled by her knowledge. "You know about timber framing?" She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I know about a lot of things, Mr. Miller. It tends to come in handy in my line of work." She watched as he began working on the bike, his hands moving with the sure confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime fixing things. "Though I have to admit, bicycle repair isn't one of my specialties." "Call me James," he said, carefully untangling the chain. "And this isn't so different from working on farm equipment. It's all about understanding how things fit together and what to do when they come apart." The next hour passed in comfortable conversation as James worked. Alexandra proved to be an engaging presence, asking thoughtful questions about the farm, sharing stories of her own travels, and displaying a surprising knowledge of agriculture that went well beyond casual interest. "The problem with modern farming," she said at one point, "is that we've lost the connection between innovation and tradition. There's this idea that you have to choose between the old ways and the new, but the real magic happens when you find ways to blend them." James looked up from the bike, struck by how similar her words were to Sarah's. His late wife had always talked about finding that balance, about honoring the past while embracing the future. "You sound like you've given this some thought." Alexandra's expression turned thoughtful. "Let's just say I've seen both sides of the equation. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that everyone else has overlooked." As James made the final adjustments to her bike, he found himself wondering about this mysterious woman who talked about timber framing and agricultural philosophy with equal ease. There was something about her that didn't quite add up, a depth beneath the polished surface that hinted at more than she was revealing. "That should do it," he said finally, stepping back to admire his work. The chain gleamed properly tensioned now, and the derailleur had been carefully straightened and adjusted. "Good as new. Maybe better." Alexandra ran her hand along the frame, checking his work with an expert's touch. "This is remarkable, James. Thank you." She reached for her wallet, but James waved her off. "Not necessary," he said. "We take care of each other out here. It's how things work." Something flickered in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "That's becoming rare these days," she said softly. "People helping people, no strings attached." As she prepared to leave, Alexandra paused at the barn door, looking back at the farm with an expression James couldn't quite read. You know, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have a way of coming back to us when we least expect it. James watched her ride away, the bicycle moving smoothly now under her expert handling. The sun was starting its westward descent, casting long shadows across the fields. He couldn't have known then how prophetic her words would prove to be, or how this chance encounter would set in motion events that would transform not just his farm, but his entire world. For now, he simply returned to his daily tasks, his father's toolbox restored to its place of honor on the shelf, waiting for the next thing that needed fixing. But something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the first hint of changing seasons in the air. A seed had been planted, though James didn't yet know what it would grow into. James couldn't shake the conversation with Alexandra from his mind as he worked through the afternoon. Her words about tradition and innovation kept surfacing as he tended to his daily tasks, mixing with memories of Sarah's similar dreams for the farm. The sun was beginning to set when he heard the now familiar sound of bicycle wheels on gravel. "I hope you don't mind another visitor," Alexandra called out, wheeling her bike toward where he stood near the cornfield. "I wanted to thank you properly for your help earlier." She held up a brown paper bag that smelled tantalizingly of fresh bread and coffee. James found himself smiling despite his usual wariness of unexpected guests. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she replied, setting her bike against the fence. "But I also wanted to ask you something about your irrigation system. I noticed the newer sections aren't running." The observation caught him off guard. Most people wouldn't have noticed such a detail, let alone understood its significance. "You've got a sharp eye," he said, studying her with renewed interest. "May I?" She gestured toward the fields. James nodded, and they walked together along the rows of struggling corn. Alexandra moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at, occasionally kneeling to examine the soil or the irrigation pipes. "Your soil composition is actually excellent," she commented, letting the dark earth sift through her fingers. "With the right water management system, this land could produce yields you wouldn't believe." James stopped walking. "Who are you really, Alexandra Burke?" She straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands. "Someone who recognizes potential when she sees it." Her eyes met his, direct and challenging. "Would you be willing to show me your farm records? Sometimes the past can tell us a lot about the future." James hesitated. The old farm ledger contained generations of Miller family history, crop yields, weather patterns, successes and failures carefully documented in his grandfather's precise handwriting, followed by his father's more cramped style, and finally, his own entries. It wasn't something he shared lightly, but there was something about Alexandra that made him want to trust her. Perhaps it was the way she looked at his struggling farm and saw possibility instead of failure. "Follow me," he said finally. In his office, really just a corner of the farmhouse kitchen, James pulled the leather-bound ledger from its shelf. The book was thick with decades of history, its pages yellow with age, but still sturdy. Alexandra handled it with reverence, her fingers tracing the careful notations. "This is remarkable," she murmured, studying a page of crop rotations from the 1960s. "Your grandfather was ahead of his time with these sustainable farming practices." She flipped forward several pages. "But something changed in the 80s. Industrial farming took over," James explained, pouring them both coffee from the thermos. She'd brought big operations, heavy machinery, chemical fertilizers. It became harder for small farms to compete. Alexandra nodded, still absorbed in the ledger. "But look at these soil composition reports from your grandfather's time. The natural fertility levels were exceptional." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "James, do you realize what you have here? A failing farm with outdated equipment?" he offered dryly. "No," she said, her voice intense. "You have land that hasn't been destroyed by decades of chemical farming. Soil that could be certified organic with minimal intervention. Do you know how rare that is? James sat down heavily in his father's old chair. Organic certification is expensive, and even if we could afford it, the transition period would put us under. Alexandra turned to a clean page in the ledger, pulling a pen from her bag. Let me show you something. She began sketching rapidly, diagrams of water management systems, crop rotation patterns, market projections. Her knowledge was comprehensive and practical, far beyond what any casual cyclist should possess. These systems, she explained, drawing another diagram, can reduce water consumption by 60% while improving yield. And here, she flipped to another page. This is what your market potential could look like with organic certification and proper marketing channels. The numbers she wrote down were staggering. James wanted to dismiss them as fantasy, but her calculations were too precise, too well-researched to be mere speculation. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Alexandra's smile was both mysterious and sincere. Let's just say I have some experience in agricultural transformation projects. She closed the ledger carefully. James, your grandfather built something remarkable here, and your father, from what I can see in these records, fought hard to preserve it during some very difficult times. She stood up, walking to the kitchen window that overlooked the fields. The setting sun painted the struggling crops in shades of gold and shadow. But maybe preserving something doesn't always mean keeping it exactly the same. Sometimes it means helping it evolve into what it needs to become. James joined her at the window, seeing his farm through new eyes. The problems were still there. The failing irrigation, the poor yields, the mounting debt, but for the first time in years, he could glimpse something else too. Possibility. Why are you really here, Alexandra? He asked quietly. She turned to face him, her expression serious. Because I believe in second chances, James, and because sometimes the things we think are endings are really just new beginnings in disguise. She gathered her things, preparing to leave. Think about what I've said, about what your farm could become. As she wheeled her bike down the driveway, the last rays of sunlight caught her hair, turning it to fire. James watched her go, the old ledger heavy in his hands, its pages filled with the weight of history and the whisper of future possibilities. That night, long after Alexandra had gone, James sat at his kitchen table with the ledger open before him. He traced his finger over his grandfather's neat columns of figures, his father's careful notes, his own increasingly desperate entries. But now, between the lines of past struggle, he could see something new emerging, a story not yet written, a future not yet determined. He couldn't have known then that Alexandra Burke would return the next day, not on a bicycle, but in a way that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate and fortune. For now, he simply sat with the ledger and his thoughts, while outside his window the Maine night wrapped his troubled farm in darkness and dreams of what might be. Dawn broke over Miller's farm with the sharp rap of knuckles on James's screen. A door. Ted Harrison stood on the porch, his usual easygoing manner replaced by barely contained excitement. "Jim, you need to come see this," Ted said, not bothering with a greeting. "Down at Mason's Point, there's a yacht. Biggest damn thing I've ever seen in our harbor." James frowned over his coffee mug. A yacht? In Mason's Point? The small harbor barely had space for the local fishing boats, let alone anything larger. "Not just any yacht," Ted continued, practically bouncing on his heels. "Word is it belongs to Alexandra Burke. The Alexandra Burke." The name hit James like a physical force. "What do you mean, the Alexandra Burke?" Ted pulled out his phone, fingers fumbling as he pulled up a web page. Alexandra Burke, founder of Ecotech Innovations, that company that's been revolutionizing sustainable agriculture across the country. Worth billions, Jim, billions. James took the phone, staring at the photo on the screen. There she was, The woman who'd let him fix her bicycle yesterday, dressed in elegant business attire, accepting some kind of environmental innovation award. The article headline read, Ecotech's Burke continues agricultural revolution with groundbreaking. Sustainable farming technology. This has to be a mistake, James muttered. But even as he said it, pieces began falling into place. Her knowledge of advanced farming techniques, her understanding of market dynamics, the way she'd studied his farm with an expert's eye. Before Ted could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. A sleek black SUV was making its way up his driveway, followed by what looked like a mobile office trailer being towed by a heavy-duty truck. What in the world? James stepped onto his porch, watching as the vehicles came to a stop in his yard. The SUV's door opened and Alexandra stepped out, but not the Alexandra of yesterday. This Alexandra wore a tailored business suit that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. Her hair elegant, her presence commanding. "Good morning, James," she called out, striding toward him with the confidence of someone used to running board meetings. "I hope you don't mind that I brought a few things. We have a lot to discuss." Ted made a strangled sound beside him. James just stared, trying to reconcile the cyclist who'd studied his father's ledger with this polished business mogul. "You could have mentioned who you were," he finally managed. Alexandra's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Would you have treated me the same if I had? Would you have shown me your ledger, shared your family's history?" She gestured to the trailer behind her. "This is my mobile command center. I thought we could review some proposals, unless you're not interested in revolutionizing your farm." The question hung in the air between them. Ted nudged James with his elbow. "Jim," he whispered urgently. "That's Alexandra Burke." "I heard." "You the first time, Ted?" James said dryly. To Alexandra, he added, "You'll understand if I'm a little overwhelmed here." She nodded, completely unfazed. "Of course. How about we start with coffee? I brought real espresso this time." She turned to Ted with a warm smile. "Mr. Harrison, right? The feed store owner? We'll need your expertise as well, if you're willing to join us." Ted looked like he might faint. "My expertise?" "Yes, ma'am. I mean, Ms. Burke. I mean, Alexandra, please," she said, then turned back to James. "Well?" James looked at his farm. The struggling fields, the aging equipment, the faded dreams. Then he looked at Alexandra, who'd shown up on a bicycle, and seen past all of that to something he'd stopped believing in years ago. Potential. "Coffee sounds good," he said finally. The mobile command center turned out to be a marvel of modern technology. Inside, high-resolution screens displayed satellite imagery of his farm, soil composition maps, and market analysis data. Alexandra moved through the space with practiced ease, pulling up documents and projections, while her team, who'd apparently been waiting at the yacht, began arriving in a steady stream of vehicles. "Your farm sits on what we call legacy soil," Alexandra explained, pointing to a detailed soil analysis. "Generations of careful stewardship by your family protected it from the worst excesses of industrial farming. That makes it incredibly valuable." James watched as she pulled up another screen showing global organic farming trends. "But the equipment, the certification process, it's all too expensive." "That's where I come in," Alexandra said, pulling out a thick folder. "I want to propose a partnership. Ecotech provides the capital, technology, and market access. You provide the land and your expertise in traditional farming methods. We transform Miller's Farm into a model of sustainable agriculture, combining the best of old and new." The numbers in the proposal made James's head spin. The investment would be massive, but the projected returns were even more staggering. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Why this farm?" Alexandra's expression turned thoughtful. "Yesterday, when you fixed my bike, which, by the way, I didn't break by accident, you didn't just repair it. You took the time to teach me about what you were doing. You showed pride in your work, respect for your tools, and a deep understanding of how things fit together." She smiled. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in our partners. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. Word had spread through the small community, and curious neighbors were gathering at the edge of his property. James could see Ted, enthusiastically explaining something to a group of locals, gesturing toward the farm with unprecedented excitement. "This would change everything," James said quietly. "Yes," Alexandra agreed, "but not in the way Sullivan's development would change it. We're not here to pave over your family's legacy, James. We're here to help it grow into something new." The memory of Sarah surfaced, her voice weak, but her eyes bright with conviction. "This land has magic in it, James. It just needs someone who can see it." He looked at Alexandra, this unexpected miracle in business attire who'd arrived on a bicycle and returned on a yacht. "You saw it, didn't you? The potential, right from the start," she nodded. "It's what I do. But more importantly, it's what you did too, every day for 30 years, even when things seemed hopeless. You kept believing in this land." She held out a hand. "So what do you say, ready to show the world what Miller's Farm can really do?" Through the command center's window, James could see the morning sun illuminating his fields. The struggling corn didn't look quite so desperate anymore. Instead, it looked like promise, waiting to be fulfilled. He thought about his grandfather's careful notes in the ledger, his father's determination to keep the farm alive through hard times, Sarah's unwavering faith in the land's potential. Sometimes the biggest acts of faith come not in holding on to what was, but in being brave enough to reach for what could be. James took Alexandra's hand. "Let's revolutionize some agriculture." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed Miller's Farm into something resembling a high-tech command center. Alexandra's team had set up temporary offices in the barn, their laptops and tablets a stark contrast to the weathered wooden beams overhead. But it was the renovation plans spread across his kitchen table that currently held James's attention. "These systems," Alexandra explained, tracing her finger along the blueprint, "will preserve the barn's historical structure while incorporating state-of-the-art climate control and monitoring technology." She glanced up at him. "What do you think?" James studied the plans, noting how carefully they integrated modern innovations with the existing architecture. "You're really serious about preserving the old while bringing in the new, aren't you?" "I told you, that's where the magic happens." Alexandra smiled, but her eyes held a hint of uncertainty. "Are you having second thoughts?" He shook his head, surprised to realize he wasn't. "No, just processing. Yesterday I was worried about foreclosure. Today I'm looking at plans for a computerized irrigation system that costs more than my entire farm. The best investments often seem impossible at first," she said, pulling out another set of drawings. "Speaking of which, wait until you see what we have planned for the North Field." But before she could elaborate, Ted burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Jim, the Sullivan's people are here, and they look mad as hornets." James and Alexandra exchanged glances before heading outside. Sure enough, a gleaming black Mercedes had pulled up beside the mobile command center, and Richard Sullivan himself was stepping out, his expensive suit looking out of place among the farm equipment. "Miller!" Sullivan called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to getting his way. "I thought we should talk about—" He stopped short at the sight of Alexandra, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to careful calculation in the span of seconds. "Ms. Burke," he said, recovering quickly, "I had no idea Ecotech was interested in this property." "Mr. Sullivan." Alexandra's tone was professional but cool. "We find Miller's Farm has exactly the kind of potential we look for in our partners." Sullivan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps we could discuss a mutual arrangement that would benefit all parties involved." "I don't think so," Alexandra replied. "Our vision for sustainable agriculture doesn't include golf courses." The exchange felt like a tennis match between corporate titans, with James's farm as the ball in play. But something had changed. He was no longer the desperate farmer being pressured to sell. He was a partner in something bigger. "The farm's not for sale, Richard," James said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Sullivan's facade cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake, Miller. Burke's people will bleed you dry with consultants and studies, then move on to the next project. We're offering real money, guaranteed." "What you're offering is the death of everything my family built," James countered. "Alexandra's offering a chance to make it grow." Sullivan's face darkened. "We'll see about that." He turned on his heel, but Alexandra's voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan, you might want to know that Ecotech just acquired the development rights to all the agricultural land surrounding Miller's farm. Any future development in this area will need to comply with our sustainable agriculture guidelines." The look Sullivan gave her could have frozen hell, but he left without another word. As his Mercedes disappeared down the driveway, Ted let out a low whistle. "That was better than movies." James turned to Alexandra. "Did you really buy the surrounding land?" "Actually, yes. Last night." She shrugged at his surprised expression. "I protect my investments. Speaking of which, shall we get back to those Northfield plans?" But James wasn't ready to move on just yet. "Why are you really doing all this, Alexandra? The truth this time." She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the fields where survey teams were already at work. "My grandfather had a farm," she said finally. "Nothing as big as this. Just a small operation in Vermont. He understood something that most people have forgotten, that farming isn't just about producing food. It's about being a steward of the land for future generations." She turned to face him, her professional mask slipping to reveal something more personal. "He lost his farm to developers like Sullivan. I was 12, but I never forgot how it felt watching them tear down the barn my grandfather built with his own hands. I promised myself that when I had the power to prevent that from happening to other family farms, I would." "Is that why you showed up on a bicycle? To understand who I was before revealing your plans?" Alexandra smiled. "I've learned that the best way to know someone's character is to meet them when they think you need their help, not their signature on a contract." Her expression turned serious. "You could have dismissed me as a stranded cyclist, but instead you took the time to teach me about what you were doing. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of partner you'd be." James felt something shift between them, a deepening of understanding, a recognition of shared values beneath their very different exteriors. Before he could respond, one of Alexandra's team members approached with urgent questions about equipment specifications. As she turned to address the concerns, James watched her seamlessly switch back into business mode, directing her team with confident efficiency. But now he saw beneath the polished surface to the farm girl from Vermont, who still remembered the sound of her grandfather's barn being torn down. The sun was setting by the time the last of the day's meetings concluded. Alexandra's team had departed for their hotels in town, leaving them alone in the quiet farmhouse kitchen. James made coffee, real espresso now, courtesy of the machine Alexandra's people had installed that morning. "You know," he said, sliding a cup across the table. To her, Sarah would have loved all of this. The blending of old and new, the chance to make something different but still true to its roots. Alexandra accepted the coffee with a tired smile. "Tell me about her?" And so, as night fell over the farm where so much change was brewing, James shared stories of Sarah, her dreams for the farm, her unwavering optimism, her belief in the magic of the land. Alexandra listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing her own memories of her grandfather's farm. Neither of them could have predicted how this partnership would evolve or how their shared vision would transform not just the farm, but their lives. For now, they simply sat in comfortable companionship, two people from different worlds brought together by a broken bicycle and a shared understanding of what it means to honor the past while building the future. The first greenhouse foundation took shape like a prophecy emerging from the earth. James stood with Alexandra in the cool morning air, watching as construction crews laid the groundwork for what would become the farm's new heart. The massive concrete pad gleamed wet in the dawn light, its perfect lines a stark contrast to the weathered buildings around it. "Hard to believe this was just an empty field yesterday," James said, his breath visible in the autumn chill. Alexandra nodded, her tablet displaying real-time updates from the construction team. "Wait until you see what it looks like by sunset. The frame goes up today. They'd chosen this spot carefully, close enough to the old barn to honor the farm's heritage, but positioned to maximize the natural slope for water management. The greenhouse would be the first of 3, each incorporating cutting-edge technology while maintaining the aesthetic of traditional farm architecture. "Your father would have appreciated this," Ted remarked, appearing beside them with coffee, cups in hand. He'd appointed himself unofficial project supervisor, his feed store temporarily managed by his daughter while he helped oversee the farm's transformation. He always said farming had to evolve or die. James accepted the coffee, remembering his father's constant tinkering with equipment, always trying to squeeze one more season out of aging machinery. He did his best with what he had, and now we're building on that foundation, Alexandra added, her shoulder brushing against James's as she leaned in to point out details on her tablet. "See these solar panels? They'll power the entire greenhouse complex, with excess feeding back into the main grid." The touch was casual, probably unconscious, but it sent an unexpected warmth through James that had nothing to do with the coffee. He'd begun to notice these moments more frequently, the way Alexandra's professional demeanor softened when they worked together, how their conversations easily flowed between business and personal matters. The sound of heavy machinery drew their attention as the first steel beams of the greenhouse frame were carefully positioned. The construction crew moved with practiced precision, their movements choreographed like a well-rehearsed dance. "Ms. Burke!" One of the tech specialists jogged over, tablet in hand. "The soil sensors are showing some interesting readings. You might want to take a look." Alexandra studied the data, her expression brightening. "James, remember what I said about your soil being special? Look at these mineral profiles." The numbers meant little to James, but Alexandra's excitement was contagious. She explained how the unique composition of his soil, preserved through generations of careful farming, made it ideal for organic cultivation. "This is better than we hoped. The certification process will be smoother than projected." By midday, the greenhouse frame stood complete, its skeletal structure reaching toward the sky like hands in prayer. Local farmers had begun gathering at the property edge, their trucks parked along the road as they watched the future taking shape. James could hear their murmured conversations, a mix of skepticism and hope. "They'll understand once they see it working," Alexandra said softly, reading his thoughts. "Change is always hardest at the beginning." She was right, of course. Already the project was having ripple effects through the community. Ted's feed store was transitioning to stock organic options. Local equipment repair shops were upgrading to handle the new machinery, and 3 neighboring farms had approached Alexandra about similar partnerships. As the sun began to set, the construction crew fitted the last of the specialized glass panels. The greenhouse caught the dying light and held it, glowing like a golden beacon of possibility. James thought about all the sunsets he'd watched over this field, all the times he'd stood here hoping for a miracle. "Thank you," he said quietly. To Alexandra, she turned to him, surprise flickering across her face. "For what?" "For seeing what I'd stopped seeing. The potential here." Alexandra's expression softened. "Sometimes we all need someone to remind us of what's possible." She hesitated, then added, "I should thank you, too, for trusting me enough to take this leap." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that went beyond business partnerships and agricultural innovations. But before either could acknowledge it, Ted called them over to inspect the completed structure. The greenhouse stood ready for its first plantings, a marriage of past and future, of tradition and innovation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new steps forward. But for now, as darkness settled over Miller's farm, the gleaming greenhouse stood as a testament to the power of belief in the land, in progress, and in the magic of new beginnings. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the greenhouse completion. James stood in the climate-controlled space, holding a withered tomato plant that should have been thriving. Around him, rows of similarly struggling seedlings drooped despite the perfect temperature and humidity readings on the monitors. "I don't understand," he muttered, examining the plant's yellowing leaves. "Everything set exactly to specifications." Alexandra frowned at her tablet, scrolling through data readouts. "The nutrient levels are optimal, the pH is perfect, the soil composition." She stopped, her eyes narrowing. "Wait, when did we last check the water filtration system?" Before James could answer, a commotion outside drew their attention. Ted burst through the greenhouse door, his face flushed. "We've got protesters at the front gate. Sullivan's people have been spreading rumors about genetic modification and chemical contamination." James felt his stomach twist. Through the greenhouse's crystal-clear panels, he could see a small group gathering at the property entrance, their homemade signs declaring "Save our farms" and "No to corporate agriculture." "These are our neighbors," he said quietly. "People I've known my whole life." Alexandra's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing genuine concern. "We knew there would be resistance. Change frightens people, especially when they don't understand it." She looked down at the failing plants. "But we need to solve this problem first. A successful harvest is our best answer to their fears." They traced the irrigation lines back to the main filtration system, Alexandra's team running diagnostics, while James checked each connection manually. The problem revealed itself in the form of mineral buildup in the main filter. A simple issue, but one that had threatened their entire first crop. "It's my fault," James said as they worked to clean the system. "I should have been checking this daily, not just trusting the automation." Alexandra wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt that made her look more farmer than CEO. "No, it's mine. I should have remembered that new systems need closer monitoring at first. We got caught up in the excitement of progress and forgot some farming basics." Their eyes met over the disassembled filter, and suddenly they both laughed, a release of tension that echoed through the greenhouse. Here they were, a billionaire tech innovator and a generational farmer, both humbled by a clogged water filter. "You know what this reminds me of?" James said, reaching for a wrench. "My father's old tractor used to break down every spring like clockwork. He'd spend hours tinkering with it, teaching me that sometimes you have to go backward to move forward." Alexandra nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My grandfather was the same way. He used to say that every failure is just education in disguise." She glanced toward the protesters, still visible through the greenhouse walls. "Maybe that's what we need to show them, that we're not trying to replace the old ways, just building on them." They worked together to reassemble the filtration system, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. By sunset, fresh water was flowing properly through the lines, and the withered plants had perked up noticeably. But the day's challenges had left their mark, forcing both James and Alexandra to confront the complex reality of their vision. "We should organize an open house," Alexandra suggested as they watched the protesters finally disperse. "Let people see what we're really doing here. Show them how we're honoring traditional farming while making it sustainable for the future." James thought about his neighbors' fears, their signs, their misunderstandings. "They need to see that this is still Miller's farm," he said slowly. "That all this technology doesn't mean we've forgotten our roots." Alexandra touched his arm gently. "Then that's what we'll show them. But first," she gestured to the rows of recovering plants, "we need to prove to ourselves that this can work." As night fell over the greenhouse, its glass panels reflecting the first stars, James realized that their greatest challenge wasn't the technology or even the community's resistance. It was finding the delicate balance between progress and preservation, between innovation and tradition. Like the plants they were nurturing, this new vision needed both strong roots and room to grow. The morning of the harvest dawned clear and crisp, painting the greenhouse in shades of amber and gold. James stood among rows of thriving plants, their branches heavy with perfectly ripened tomatoes, each one a testament to the marriage of traditional farming wisdom and modern innovation. "I've never seen anything like this," Ted whispered, cradling one of the tomatoes as if it were made of crystal. "Not in 30 years of farming." The fruit was extraordinary, rich red with subtle gold streaks, each one nearly twice the size of conventional tomatoes. But it wasn't just their appearance that was remarkable. Initial testing had shown nutrient levels far exceeding organic standards, with a flavor profile that professional chefs would dream about. "The soil composition was the key," Alexandra explained, reviewing data on her tablet. "By combining your family's generations of careful land management with our precision farming techniques, we've created something unique." She looked up at James, her eyes bright with shared triumph. "Your grandfather's methods laid the groundwork for this, literally." Local media had gathered outside, drawn by rumors of the breakthrough harvest. What had started as a small event had grown into something larger, with organic farming experts, agricultural journalists, and even a few celebrity chefs making the journey to witness what was happening at Miller's farm. "Are you ready?" Alexandra asked softly, standing close enough that James could smell the subtle scent of her perfume, mixing with the earthy greenhouse air. He nodded, thinking of how far they'd come from that first failed crop. "Let's show them what the future of farming looks like." The greenhouse doors opened, and the crowd gasped collectively at the sight. Sunlight streamed through the advanced glass panels, illuminating row after row of perfect produce. But it wasn't just the tomatoes that captured their attention. It was the seamless blend of old and new, of tradition and technology. James led the tour, explaining how they'd integrated his family's traditional farming techniques with ecotech's innovations. Alexandra followed, adding technical details about their breakthrough growing methods. Together, they painted a picture of agricultural evolution that honored the past while embracing the future. "The real magic," James explained to a captivated group of local farmers, "is in how the automated systems work with natural growing cycles, not against them." He demonstrated the smart irrigation system, showing how it adjusted based on individual plant needs rather than blanket watering schedules. "But none of this would work," Alexandra added, "without the foundation of healthy soil that the Miller family maintained for generations." This success isn't about replacing traditional farming, it's about enhancing it. Among the visitors, James spotted some of the same faces that had protested weeks earlier. Now they watched with cautious interest as Ted demonstrated how the farm's new systems could be monitored from a simple smartphone app. "Think about it," Ted told them, his enthusiasm infectious. "No more getting up at 2 a.m. to check on things during a frost. The system alerts you if there's a problem, and you can adjust everything remotely." The transformation wasn't limited to the greenhouse. Outside, construction had begun on a state-of-the-art processing facility that would allow them to package and ship their produce directly to high-end restaurants and organic markets. The old barn was being carefully restored, its historic frame reinforced while maintaining its original character. As the day progressed, James found himself sharing more personal stories about his father's determination to keep the farm alive during hard times, about Sarah's dreams for the future, about the weight of being the last Miller to work this land. To his surprise, the stories resonated deeply with their visitors, who saw in Miller's farm a possible future for their own struggling operations. "It's not just about the technology," he heard Alexandra telling a group of skeptical older farmers. It's about finding ways to make family farming viable for the next generation, to give them reasons to stay instead of selling to developers. The sentiment struck a chord. By afternoon, several neighboring farms had approached them about implementing similar systems. Ted was overwhelmed with questions about transitioning to organic feed supplies. Even the local bank representative, who had once been so eager to foreclose, was quietly discussing financing options for agricultural modernization. But the day's most powerful moment came when James led Alexandra away from the crowds to a corner of the property. There, hidden from view by old apple trees his grandfather had planted, was a small plot he'd been tending in secret. "I wanted to show you this," he said, gesturing to the carefully tended rows. "I've been experimenting with some of your methods on my father's old vegetable patch." Alexandra knelt to examine the plants, her expression softening. Among the traditional crops were new varieties she had mentioned wanting to try, each one adapted to their specific soil conditions and climate. "You did this on your own?" she asked, touching a leaf gently. "I needed to understand it for myself, I guess, to prove that I could blend your vision with my family's legacy." He paused, watching her examine his work. "Alexandra, She stood, turning to face him, and something in her expression made the rest of his words catch in his throat. They stood close, the late afternoon sun filtering through the apple trees, casting dappled shadows across their faces. "James," she said softly, "Ms. Burke," one of her team members called from beyond the trees. "The governor's office is on the line. They want to discuss expanding the program statewide." The moment shattered like frost in morning. Sun. Alexandra's professional mask slipped back into place, though her eyes lingered on James's face. "We should get back," she said quietly. James nodded, understanding the weight of what was happening to them, both the farm and whatever was growing between them. Like the crops in his experimental plot, it was something that needed the right conditions, the right timing, the right balance of elements to thrive. As they walked back to the greenhouse, where success and celebration awaited, James thought about how farming had taught him patience with the land, with growth, with change. Some harvests couldn't be rushed, no matter how promising the early signs. The day ended with a sunset that seemed determined to outshine their success, painting the greenhouse in shades of fire and promise. As the last visitors departed, James and Alexandra stood in comfortable silence, watching their shared vision gleam in the fading light. "We did it," Alexandra said simply. "No," James corrected her. "We're doing it. This is just the beginning." She smiled, understanding his meaning. Like the farm itself, some transformations were ongoing, growing deeper roots even as they reached for new heights. The local newspapers' headline said it all: "Miller's Farm Revolution, a new dawn for Maine agriculture." The article, spread across the front page, featured a photo of James and Alexandra standing in front of their thriving greenhouse, her corporate polish somehow perfectly complementing his farmer's pragmatism. "Fourth request this morning," Ted announced, waving another message from his phone. "The Peterson family over in Bristol wants to know if they can tour the facility. Their farm's been struggling since the dairy prices dropped." James looked up from where he was calibrating the new soil sensors. The greenhouse hummed with efficient productivity around him, every plant precisely monitored, yet still tended with human care. "Schedule them for next week's open house. Might as well show everyone at once." The transformation of Miller's Farm had become something of a local phenomenon. What started as skepticism had evolved into cautious hope, then outright enthusiasm as the results became impossible to ignore. The farm's organic certification had come through in record time, thanks to generations of chemical-free soil management. Now, high-end restaurants in Boston were fighting over contracts for their produce. "Did you see the latest yield projections?" Alexandra asked, entering with her tablet and a fresh cup of coffee for each of them. The casual gesture felt natural now, part of their daily rhythm. We're going to need to accelerate the expansion timeline. She pulled up the numbers, and they huddled together over the screen. Their shoulders touched, a brief contact that sent warmth through James, despite the greenhouse's controlled climate. These moments had been happening more frequently. Small touches, shared glances, conversations that lingered longer than strictly necessary for business. "The Collins place next door," James said, trying to focus on the data rather than Alexandra's proximity. "They're retiring. No children interested in taking over. Might be worth talking to them about expanding there." Alexandra nodded, making notes. "I'll have my team run an analysis. The soil composition should be similar, given the property line." Outside, a steady stream of trucks moved along the improved access road. Suppliers delivering materials for the processing facility, construction crews working on the barn renovation, local farmers coming to learn about the new methods. Miller's farm had become a hub of activity, a living laboratory for the future of agriculture. "You know what this reminds me of?" Ted mused, watching the activity. "The railway coming through in my grandfather's time. Everybody said it would ruin farming, but instead it opened up new markets. Sometimes change is like that, scary until it shows you its possibilities." James thought about how much had changed in just a few months. The foreclosure notice that had seemed like an ending had instead become a beginning. His father's weathered ledger now sat beside cutting-edge tablets, old wisdom informing new methods. "Alexandra," he started, then corrected himself at her raised eyebrow. "Alex, do you ever wonder if—" The sound of helicopter blades interrupted him. They stepped outside to see a sleek corporate chopper descending on the newly constructed landing. Ampad. A delegation from the Governor's Agricultural Committee had arrived for their scheduled tour. Alexandra straightened her jacket, professional mode engaging smoothly. But before she turned to greet the officials, she touched James's arm lightly. "Tell me later." He nodded, watching her stride confidently toward the helicopter. In the greenhouse behind him, plants thrived under the perfect fusion of nature and technology. In the fields beyond, new possibilities were taking root with every passing day. The rising tide of change was lifting more than just Miller's farm. It was lifting an entire community's hopes for the future, proving that progress didn't have to mean losing touch with the past. And maybe, just maybe, it was lifting something else too, something growing as carefully and promisingly as their first successful crop. But like any good farmer, James knew the importance of timing. Some harvests couldn't be rushed. The threatening letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its legal letterhead stark against the pile of seed catalogs and equipment invoices. James found Alexandra already in the office, her face tight with concern. As she read a similar document, "Sullivan's development," she said before he could ask. "They're challenging our organic certification, claiming our technology invalidates traditional farming methods." James dropped into the chair across from her, his own letter landing on the desk between them. "They're also disputing the water rights for the expanded irrigation system, saying it could affect groundwater levels for neighboring properties." "Classic delay tactics," Alexandra muttered, pulling up documents on her tablet. "They can't stop us legally, so they're trying to bury us in regulatory challenges." She looked up at him, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, James. I should have seen this coming." Before he could respond, Ted burst through the door waving a newspaper. "Have you seen this? Sullivan's people are running full-page ads in the county paper. Traditional values versus corporate farming, the truth about Miller's farm." The advertisement was a masterpiece of manipulation, featuring a black-and-white photo of James's father working the fields, contrasted with a stark, industrial-looking greenhouse complex. Not their greenhouse, James noted, but the implication was clear. "They're trying to turn the community against us," Alexandra said quietly. "Make it look like we're destroying farming heritage rather than preserving it." Outside the office window, construction on the processing facility had slowed as workers huddled around their phones, presumably reading the same headlines. The morning fog hung heavy over the fields, as if the land itself was holding its breath. "It's not just the ads," Ted added hesitantly. "Sullivan's been approaching other farmers, offering to buy their land at premium prices, but only if they publicly oppose our methods. The Hendersons already took the deal." James felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. The Hendersons had been friends of his family for decades. Their farms had shared equipment, helped each other through tough harvests, celebrated together in good years. "Mr. Miller," one of Alexandra's team members, appeared in the doorway. "The environmental assessment team is here. They need to start their groundwater survey immediately." Alexandra stood, her business armor sliding back into place. "I'll handle the survey team. James, maybe you should talk to the Hendersons. They might listen to you." But as she passed him, her hand brushed his shoulder, a brief touch that carried more meaning than words. They'd grown closer over the months, their relationship deepening alongside their shared vision for the farm. Now that connection felt like both a strength and a vulnerability. James drove to the Henderson farm that afternoon, the familiar route now feeling somehow foreign. Mark Henderson met him on the porch, discomfort written across his weathered face. "It's not personal, Jim," Mark said before James could speak. "But farming's changing too fast. Sullivan's offering us a way out with dignity." "Dignity?" James couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "By selling to developers who'll pave over everything our family's built? At least we'll be able to retire." Mark countered. "Not all of us have billionaire partners swooping in to save us." The words stung, carrying implications about both the farm and his relationship with Alexandra. James drove back slowly, his mind churning. The fog had lifted, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, a storm brewing both literally and figuratively. Back at the farm, he found Alexandra in the greenhouse, her jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up as she worked alongside the regular crew. She looked up as he entered, reading his expression instantly. "That bad?" "Worse," he admitted. "Sullivan's playing on their fears, their pride, making us look like the enemy of everything they've worked for." Alexandra straightened, determination replacing concern. "Then we'll show them they're wrong, not with words, with results." She gestured to the thriving plants around them. "This is still Miller's farm, James. No amount of propaganda can change that. The gathering storm would test more than their business partnership. It would challenge everything they'd built together, both on the farm and between them. But like the crops they tended, the strongest roots often grow deeper in adverse conditions." The partnership agreement lay unsigned on James's kitchen table, its legal language a stark contrast to the homey surroundings. Outside, rain drummed against the window panes, matching his unsettled mood. "It's the only way to protect everything we've built," Alexandra explained, her voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "If we incorporate Miller's farm as a separate entity from Ecotech, Sullivan can't touch it. 3 months minimum. Maybe 6. She set the tablet down carefully, too carefully. "We'll lose the winter growing season. And without the revenue from that..." She didn't need to finish. James studied the document, feeling the weight of decisions that went far beyond business. The agreement would make their partnership official, binding their futures together in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. "And you'd be okay with that?" he asked carefully. "Separating this from your company?" Alexandra moved to the window, watching rain streak down the glass. "James, this was never just another Ecotech project for me. You know that." The unspoken thing between them hung in the air, as tangible as the storm outside. They'd been dancing around it for months, their growing feelings complicated by business responsibilities and community pressures. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Ted entered, shaking rain from his coat. "Sorry to barge in, but you both need to see this." He handed Alexandra his tablet, its screen displaying an urgent email from the State Agricultural Board. "They're freezing our permits," Alexandra said, her face tightening, "pending a full review of our impact on traditional farming practices." She looked up at James. "Sullivan's people are on the board." James felt anger rise in his chest. They can't just... They can, Alexandra cut in. And they have. We're shut down until the review is complete. How long? 3 months minimum. Maybe 6. She set the Yacht tablet down carefully, too carefully. We'll lose the winter growing season, and without the revenue from that... She didn't need to finish the thought. Ted shifted uncomfortably. There's more. Sullivan's called a town hall meeting for tonight. He's promising to address concerns about corporate farming threatening local traditions. James saw Alexandra's shoulders stiffen at the words, corporate farming. She'd worked so hard to prove she was different that their vision was about preserving family farms, not replacing them. I'll handle the board, she said, reaching for her phone. I have contacts in the governor's office who... No, James interrupted. We'll handle it together, tonight at the town hall. She turned to face him, surprise flickering across her features. James, these situations can get ugly. You don't have to... This is my farm, he said quietly. My community. And you're my... He paused, the word partner suddenly feeling inadequate. Understanding passed between them, deep and wordless. Alexandra moved closer, close enough that he could smell the subtle lavender of her shampoo mixing with the petrichor drifting in through the open window. "Your what?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, her phone buzzed with another urgent message. The moment slipped away, like so many before it, lost to the demands of their growing enterprise. Ted cleared his throat. I'll start calling people about tonight. Let them know you'll both be there." He retreated, leaving them alone with the unsigned agreement and all it represented. Alexandra touched the document lightly. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever you decide about this, I need you to know something." She met his eyes steadily. "I came here looking for a way to save family farms. I wasn't looking for..." "Neither was I," James said when she trailed off. "But sometimes the best crops come from unexpected seeds." She smiled at the farming metaphor, but her eyes remained serious. "Sullivan will try to make them choose between tradition and progress, between loyalty to their old ways and what we're offering. Then we'll show them they don't have to choose," James said, his decision crystallizing. He picked up the pen, but instead of signing the agreement, he held it out to her. "We'll show them together." Outside, the storm began to ease, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Like the weather, their moment of crisis carried the potential for either destruction or renewal. Everything depended on what they chose to grow from it. The town hall was packed to overflowing, faces James had known all his life, mixed with TV news crews and Sullivan's suited representatives. At the front of the room, a torn photograph of his father stood on an easel, part of Sullivan's presentation materials, James realized with growing anger. The image had been edited to show the old farm on one side and their new greenhouse complex. On the other, a visual manipulation of everything they'd worked to achieve. "This isn't just about one farm," Sullivan was saying as James and Alexandra entered. "This is about preserving our agricultural heritage, about protecting family farms from corporate takeover." Alexandra's hand brushed against James's, a small gesture of support. She wore no makeup tonight, her usual corporate polish replaced by something more authentic. They'd agreed. No PowerPoint presentations, no technical jargon. Just honest words, from the heart. "And now," Sullivan continued with theatrical timing, "we'll hear from James Miller himself. Tell us, James, what would your father think of what you've done to his legacy?" The room fell silent. James felt every eye turn to him, saw the mixture of sympathy and judgment on familiar faces. He stood slowly, but before he could speak, "Mark." Henderson's voice cut through the quiet. "Jim's father?" Mark stood, his weathered face flushed. "I knew Jim's father. Worked alongside him for 40 years, and I've been sitting here thinking what George Miller would really say about all this." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mark pointed at Sullivan's manipulated photograph. George Miller spent every penny he had trying to keep that farm alive. Remortgaged 3 times, worked second jobs in winter. "You want to talk about his legacy?" His legacy was doing whatever it took to keep the land in the family. Exactly, Sullivan jumped in. And now his son is selling out to someone who saw value where the rest of us saw failure, Mark interrupted. I was wrong about that. Jim, he turned to face the crowd. We all were. While we were crying about tradition, the Miller farm found a way to survive. And not just survive, thrive. James felt Alexandra's presence beside him, steady and sure. He reached for her hand, no longer caring who saw. My father taught me that farming isn't about holding on to the past, he said, his voice carrying in the hushed room. It's about nurturing the future. And yes, our methods are different now. But the heart of Miller's farm, the respect for the land, the commitment to quality, the belief in feeding people well, that hasn't changed. Pretty words, Sullivan cut in. But the fact remains that corporate agriculture, I'm not corporate. Agriculture, Alexandra said quietly, but her voice commanded attention. I'm the granddaughter of a Vermont farmer who lost everything to developers like you, Mr. Sullivan. Every innovation we've brought to Miller's farm has been about preserving family farming, not destroying it. She turned to the crowd. You all. And no, James. You know his character, his integrity. Do you really think he'd partner with someone who didn't share his values? The word partner hung in the air, its double meaning unmistakable. James tightened his grip on her hand, feeling the culmination of everything they'd built together, professionally and personally. The permits are suspended, Sullivan pressed, sensing he was losing ground. The project is dead. Actually, Ted's voice rang out from the back. The governor's office just called. Seems they're very interested in why certain board members tried to shut down the most promising agricultural innovation project in state history. The permits are reinstated, effective immediately. The room erupted in conversation. James saw Sullivan's face darken, saw him gather his materials with sharp, angry movements. But he barely registered it, because Alexandra had turned to him with tears in her eyes. James, she whispered, I need to tell you. But at that moment, the crowd surged forward, farmers pressing close with questions, apologies, offers of support. The personal moment shattered, replaced by the immediate demands of their success. Yet something had shifted irreversibly between them, like a seed finally breaking through to sunlight. They had weathered their breaking point, but not in the way their opponents had hoped. Instead of breaking apart, they had broken through to a new level of trust, understanding, and possibility. The question was, what would they grow from here? Dawn found James in Sarah's garden, the small plot behind the farmhouse where his late wife had tended her flowers. Her old wedding ring hung from a chain around his neck, catching the early morning light. He hadn't visited this spot in months, too busy with the farm's transformation to make time for memories. I thought I might find you here. Alexandra's voice came softly from behind him. She looked tired, but peaceful. Her usual professional attire, replaced by jeans and one of his old flannel shirts she'd borrowed after getting caught in yesterday's rain. Zara used to say this was the best place to think, James replied, making room for her on the weathered garden bench. Something about the morning light, making everything clearer. Alexandra sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She was right. I've been doing a lot of thinking myself. She paused, looking out over the garden where early autumn flowers still bloomed. About what happens next. James felt his heart tighten. In the aftermath of their victory at the town hall, they'd been swept up in congratulations and planning sessions. The moment of personal revelation between them had remained unfinished, hanging in the air like morning mist. The board wants to expand the program, Alexandra continued, not just here in Maine, but across New England. They're talking about making me head of a new division focused entirely on family farm preservation. That's incredible, James said carefully, trying to read her expression. Everything you've worked for. Almost everything. She turned to face him, her eyes carrying the same intensity they'd had when she first saw the potential in his struggling. Farm. James, do you know why I really came back that day on the yacht? Why I didn't just send a business team? He shook his head, though something in his heart already knew the answer. Because when you fixed my bike, you didn't just repair it. You taught me about it, shared your knowledge, showed me that same passion for doing things right that I remembered from my grandfather. She smiled softly. I came looking for a way to save family farms. I wasn't expecting to find a home. James touched Sarah's ring through his shirt, feeling its familiar shape. When Sarah was sick, she made me promise not to let the farm become a monument to the past. She said, his voice caught slightly, she said the land needed someone who could see its magic, who could help it grow into something new. She sounds like a wise woman, Alexandra said gently. She was. James turned to face her fully. And she would have loved what you've helped create here, not just the technology or the success, but the way you understood what this place really means, what farming really means. Alexandra's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. I meant what I said last night about being partners in everything, if that's what you want. From the main farm complex came the sounds of another day beginning, trucks arriving, equipment humming to life, voices calling morning greetings. Their successful stand at the town hall had sparked a new wave of interest, with more neighboring farms requesting tours and consultations. You know, James said, there's an old farming saying, the best growth comes after the hardest storms. Alexandra laughed softly. Are you going to answer every personal conversation with farming metaphors? Probably, he admitted, squeezing her hand. It's part of my charm. The morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows across Sarah's garden. In the distance, their greenhouse gleamed like a crystal growing from the earth, a perfect blend of past and future, just like them. So, Alexandra said, resting her head on his shoulder, partners? James smiled, feeling the weight of Sarah's ring against his heart. Not as a burden now, but as a blessing, a reminder that love, like farming, was about growth and renewal, about finding magic in the merge of old and new. Partners, he agreed, and kissed her as the morning light painted everything in shades of possibility. Ted found them in the greenhouse late that afternoon, heads bent together over Alexandra's tablet as they reviewed expansion plans. He couldn't help but notice how naturally they fit together now. The last traces of corporate formality dissolved into something warmer and more genuine. Well, it's about time, he said by way of greeting. The whole town's been taking bets on when you two would figure it out. Alexandra blushed slightly, but her smile was confident as she leaned into James's side. Sometimes the best harvests need proper timing, she said, earning a laugh from both men. Speaking of harvests, Ted continued, you've got visitors, the Henderson family's outside, all of them. James straightened, surprised. The Hendersons had been their strongest opponents before Mark's support at the town hall meeting. Now the entire extended family waited in the farm's courtyard. Mark and his wife, their children, even old Joe Henderson, who'd retired years ago. Ted burst through the door, snow dusting his shoulders. They're here. The governor's people just pulled up, and you won't believe who's with them. James and Alexandra exchanged glances before heading outside. A line of official vehicles had parked in the newly expanded lot, but it was the last car that caught their attention. Out stepped Richard Sullivan, looking decidedly less polished than during their last confrontation. Mr. Miller, Ms. Burke, he said, approaching with forced humility. The governor convinced me to reconsider my position on agricultural innovation. Alexandra's hand found James's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Did he now? Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. My investors are interested in repurposing some of our land developments for sustainable farming. We were hoping to learn from your example. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The man who tried to destroy their vision now wanted to be part of it. James felt Alexandra squeeze his hand, reading his thoughts as she'd learned to do. We'll have our team contact your office, she said professionally. Every acre saved from concrete is a victory for farming. As the governor's delegation toured the facility, James and Alexandra slipped away to their private greenhouse, the experimental space where they tested new ideas. Here, alongside the latest hydroponic systems, Sarah's old garden tools hung, carefully preserved on the wall. "Your father would love this," Alexandra said, watching the automated systems adjust to the afternoon light. All of it, the innovation, the teaching, the way the community's coming together. James smiled, remembering his father's dreams. He always said farming was about feeding both bodies and souls. He turned to face her. "Speaking of feeding people, Ted's been dropping hints about a harvest festival. Says the community needs a proper celebration of everything that's happened." Alexandra murmured, moving closer. "A celebration of partnerships, maybe." The word carried weight now, filled with all they'd become to each other. Their relationship had grown like their crops, naturally, strongly, rooted in respect, and cultivated with care. From outside came the sounds of the farm, in full operation, delivery trucks arriving for the restaurant orders, tour groups exploring the educational center, neighboring farmers attending workshops. The Miller and Burke Agricultural Innovation Center had become more than just a farm. It was a symbol of how tradition and progress could not just coexist, but flourish together. "You know," James said, pulling Alexandra close, "there's an old farming tradition about new beginnings, something about planting seeds for the future." She laughed against his chest. "Are you ever going to stop with the farming metaphors?" "Not a chance. They're part of my charm, remember?" The afternoon sun broke through the winter clouds, casting their shadows on the greenhouse wall. Two figures merged into one, like their separate dreams had merged into a shared vision. "I was thinking," Alexandra said softly, "maybe it's time to plant some new seeds of our own." The look they shared was full of promise, like spring soil waiting for rain. Their partnership, personal and professional, had transformed not just the farm, but the entire community's understanding of what was possible when old and new grew together. Outside, snow continued to fall on their flourishing greenhouses, nature's quiet blessing on a dream that had grown beyond anything they'd imagined that first day, with a broken bicycle and a willing heart. The harvest festival transformed Miller's farm into a wonderland of lights and laughter. Strings of golden bulbs crisscrossed between the historic barn and modern greenhouses, while the scent of local dishes filled the air. Every participating farm had contributed something to the feast, a tangible testament to the community's renewed vitality. Ted had outdone himself with the organizing, turning the educational center into a showcase of their journey. Photos lined the walls. The original greenhouse construction, the first successful crops, the town hall meeting that had changed everything. At the center hung the newly restored photograph of James's father, no longer torn but whole, bridging past and present. "Your father would have loved this," Mark Henderson said, approaching James with a glass of local cider. "All these farms working together, sharing knowledge instead of struggling alone." James nodded, watching Alexandra across the room, where she chatted with a group of young farmers, children of the families who'd joined their partnership program. She wore a simple blue dress instead of her usual business attire, but it was her ease with the community that truly showed how much had changed. "We've been talking," Mark said as James and Alexandra approached, "about tradition, about progress, about what it really means to honor our farming heritage." He gestured to his oldest son, who stepped forward with a worn leather folder. "These are our farm's original documents," Mark explained. "Deed, water rights, crop records going back to 1932. We'd like you to look them over. See if—" He paused, emotion catching in his voice. "See if your partnership model might work for us too." Alexandra touched James's arm gently before stepping forward. Gone was the polished corporate executive who'd arrived on a yacht. In her place stood someone who understood the weight of what the Hendersons were offering, not just their land, but their trust. "Why don't we all sit down?" she suggested. "Share some coffee. Talk about your vision for your farm's future." The group moved to the newly renovated barn, where modern conference facilities blended seamlessly with the historic structure. James watched as Alexandra listened to the Hendersons' hopes and fears, adding her technical expertise only when needed, letting the family find their own way to embracing change. "You know," old Joe Henderson said during a pause in the discussion, "I fought against every new thing that came to farming. Thought tradition was about keeping things exactly the same." He looked around the barn, taking in the careful preservation of old beams alongside new technology. "But seeing what you've done here, maybe tradition is really about keeping the heart of something alive while letting it grow." James felt Alexandra's hand slip into his. "That's exactly what we believe," she said. "Every farm has its own story, its own soul. Technology should enhance that, not replace it." The afternoon stretched into evening as more neighbors arrived, drawn by word of the Hendersons' visit. The barn became a gathering place for healing old rifts, sharing concerns, and building new dreams. Ted kept the coffee flowing while her team provided impromptu demonstrations of their farming systems. "Look at this," James said softly to Alexandra as the sunset painted the barn in warm light. "A few months ago, these same people were protesting against us." She squeezed his hand. "Sometimes people just need to see that change doesn't mean losing what matters most. It means protecting it in a new way." Mark Henderson approached them, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Jim, your father and I used to talk about the future of farming around here. Worried about it mostly, but I think he'd be proud of this, of seeing the farms coming together instead of being sold off piece by piece." "Partners?" Alexandra asked, extending her hand to Mark. He took it firmly. "Partners." Later, after the last visitors had left and darkness wrapped around the farm like a comfortable blanket, James and Alexandra stood in the doorway of the old farmhouse. The porch light illuminated the handmade sign she'd surprised him with that morning. "Miller and Burke Agricultural Innovation Center." "Partner," James said, tasting the word. "In business and everything else?" Alexandra turned in his arms, her face glowing with contentment and possibility. "Everything else," she confirmed, "though I'm keeping my bike repair options open." Their laughter echoed across the farm, where old dreams and new vision had finally, perfectly grown together. Winter came softly to Miller's farm that year, dusting the greenhouses with snow while inside. Rows of thriving plants defied the seasons. The new farm logo, a traditional barn merged with modern solar panels, flew proudly above the entrance, symbolizing everything they'd achieved. James stood in the training center they'd created in the restored barn, watching Alexandra lead a workshop for local farmers. She moved with easy confidence among the group, her technical expertise now wrapped in a farmer's practical wisdom. "The key is understanding your land's unique personality," she was saying, pulling up soil composition. Maps on the massive screen. "Every farm has its own story, its own potential. Our job is to help that potential emerge using both old wisdom and new tools." The farmers, many of whom had once opposed them, nodded in understanding. The results were hard to argue with. The first wave of partner farms was already showing remarkable yields, their success creating a ripple effect throughout the community. "Did you ever imagine this?" Ted asked, joining them. "That day when she showed up with a broken bicycle?" "Speaking of which," Alexandra said, appearing at James's side with a mysterious smile, "I have something to show you all." She led them to the barn's side entrance where, illuminated by the festival lights, stood her original bicycle. But now it was mounted on a beautiful wooden display, a plaque beneath it reading, "Where innovation meets tradition, the journey begins." "You kept it," James said softly. "Of course I did." She slipped her hand into his. "Some things are worth preserving." The festival crowd had begun to gather for the evening's main event. Local chefs had prepared a feast using produce from all the partner farms, creating dishes that celebrated both traditional recipes and modern culinary innovation. As the community settled around the long tables set up between the greenhouse and Iban, Ted clinked his glass for attention. Before we eat, I think we need to hear from the two people who made all this possible. James and Alexandra exchanged glances. They hadn't planned speeches, but standing there among their friends and partners, the words came naturally. A few months ago, this farm was on the brink of foreclosure, James began. Now look around, not just at the buildings or the technology, but at all of you, at what we've built together. Some people thought we had to choose between tradition and progress, Alexandra continued, between holding on to the past and embracing the future. But farming has always been about growth, about finding new ways to nurture what matters most. From the crowd, old Joe Henderson called out, "And some of us thought city folk couldn't understand farming." The laughter that followed carried years of healed divisions. As the feast began, James watched the easy interaction between traditional farmers and tech specialists, between old neighbors and new partners. Children darted between tables, their parents no longer worried about having to sell their family farms. "There's just one thing missing," Alexandra said quietly, drawing him away from the crowd. She led him to Sarah's garden, now beautifully illuminated with soft lights. There, in the peaceful space that had helped him find his way forward, Alexandra turned to face him. "James Miller," she said, her voice carrying the same certainty it had when she first proposed transforming his farm. "Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air like morning mist over fresh-tilled soil. Behind them, the festival's warmth and light created a gentle glow, while before them stretched the fields where their shared vision had taken root and flourished. "Yes," he said simply, drawing her close. "Partner in everything." As they returned to the celebration, the entire community seemed to know without being told. Perhaps it was the joy on their faces, or perhaps some truths were as natural as seeds growing toward sunlight. The harvest festival continued late into the night, a celebration not just of crops and innovation, but of community reborn and love. Grown in unexpected soil, under the stars and string lights, tradition and progress danced together, showing that the richest harvests often come from the most surprising seeds. Spring came early to Miller's farm the following year. James stood in the doorway of their newest greenhouse, watching Alexandra plant the first seeds of the season. She'd insisted on doing it herself, continuing the tradition his family had maintained for generations. A small velvet box held the seeds they'd carefully selected together, heritage varieties preserved by his grandfather, merged with innovative hybrids developed in their own labs. Like everything else about their partnership, it represented the perfect blend of old and new. "Ready?" Alexandra asked, looking up at him with soil-stained hands and joy in her eyes. The simple gold band on her finger caught the morning light, matching the one he now wore. "Almost," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I found something you should have." He pulled out Sarah's old wedding ring, still on its chain. "She would have wanted you to have this, not to wear, but to keep, to remember that love, like farming, is about growth and renewal." Alexandra took the ring carefully, understanding its significance. "We'll hang it in the garden," she said softly. "Where?" It all came together. Outside, the sound of arriving trucks marked the beginning of another busy day at the Miller and Burke Agricultural Innovation Center. The winter's training programs had produced their first graduating class of tech-savvy farmers. Today, those graduates would receive their certifications and return to their family farms, carrying with them the knowledge of how to blend tradition with innovation. Ted appeared in the greenhouse entrance, clipboard in hand. "Governor's office called. They're fast-tracking the expansion grants for the other farms. And that seed you developed for cold weather growing? The Canadian Agriculture Department wants to talk about licensing." James and Alexandra shared a smile. Their success had grown beyond anything they'd imagined that first day with a broken bicycle, but the heart of it remained the same, preserving family farms by helping them evolve. "Oh, and one more thing," Ted added with a grin. "Mark Henderson's daughter just enrolled in agricultural engineering. Says she wants to be just like Ms. Burke, except maybe without the bicycle dramatics." They all laughed, the sound echoing through the greenhouse where new life was taking root. Through the glass walls, they could see the farm stretching out. Before them, the restored barn, the modern facilities, the fields ready for planting. Each element told part of their story. The struggle, the transformation, the growth into something greater than themselves. "You know what my father always said about spring planting?" James said, kneeling beside Alexandra as she pressed the first seeds into fertile soil. "He said each seed carries the promise of tomorrow." Alexandra leaned against him, their shoulders touching in the familiar way that had become as natural as breathing. "More farming metaphors?" "Always," he promised, helping her cover the seeds with rich earth their families would tend for generations to come. Above them, the morning sun painted their world in shades of possibility, while below, in the soil of Miller's farm, the future took root, one seed at a time.